The sound of fabric tearing still echoes in my nightmares. Not the gentle whisper of silk against skin or the satisfying snap of a perfectly placed seam, but the violent rip of dreams being shredded in real time. 27 couture gowns, each one representing months of sleepless nights and borrowed hope, lay in tatters across the backstage floor of the Miami Convention Center. The models stood frozen in shock, their hands clutching at remnants of what should have been my breakthrough moment, while my husband Derek smiled from the doorway with a satisfaction that made my blood turn to ice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and 6 months ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. Fashion designer, devoted wife, diplomatic sister-in-law, who always found excuses for Ashley's mediocre sketches, an inflated ego. I lived in a pristine white penthouse overlooking Biscayne Bay, where Derek's real estate empire afforded us every luxury except the one thing I craved most: creative freedom. My design studio occupied the smallest room in our 3,000-square-foot space, squeezed between Derek's home office and Ashley's guest bedroom that had become her permanent residence after her latest boyfriend kicked her out. The morning of Miami Fashion Week began like every other day in our carefully orchestrated household. Derek emerged from our bedroom already dressed in his signature navy suit, phone pressed to his ear as he discussed property acquisitions with his business partner. His black hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place, and his cologne filled the kitchen with its expensive scent. He barely glanced at me as I stood at the marble island, sketching last-minute adjustments to the evening's runway lineup while my coffee grew cold. Ashley shuffled in wearing pajamas that cost more than most people's rent, her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun that somehow still looked effortlessly chic. At 26, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that opened doors without any talent behind it. She'd graduated from Parsons with a fashion design degree that Derek had purchased through generous donations, but her portfolio resembled something from a first-year student rather than a supposed industry professional. "Morning, Emma," she said, pouring herself orange juice into a crystal glass. "I've been thinking about tonight's show. Wouldn't it be amazing if you featured some of my latest pieces? I've been working on this incredible collection inspired by sustainable ocean materials." I looked up from my sketches, already knowing this conversation would test my diplomatic skills. Ashley's idea of sustainable design involved buying cheap fabrics in blue and green tones, then adding plastic beads she claimed represented, quote, ocean treasures. The execution was amateur at best, catastrophic at worst. "Ashley, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but tonight's collection has been finalized for months," I said gently. "Every piece has been fitted to specific models, and we've already sent the lineup to the press. Making changes now would be impossible." Her face darkened the way it always did when someone dared to suggest her ideas weren't brilliant. "But Emma, this could be huge for both of us. Derek always says families should support each other. Right, Derek?" My husband ended his phone call and turned toward us, his expression already showing signs of irritation. This was familiar territory for Derek, caught between his business-minded wife, who refused to compromise her artistic vision, and his sister, who expected constant validation for her lackluster talents. "What's the problem now?" he asked, straightening his tie with sharp movements. "I just suggested that Emma include some of my pieces in tonight's show, and she's being difficult about it," Ashley said, her voice taking on the whining quality that had gotten her out of trouble since childhood. Derek's jaw tightened as he looked at me. "Emma, you know how important tonight is for our family's reputation. Having Ashley represented would show unity. Besides, how much difference could a few pieces really make?" The question hit me like a physical blow. How much difference could a few pieces make? This collection represented 3 years of work, countless sacrifices, and the last chance to prove myself as a serious designer worthy of industry respect. Every piece told a story, followed a carefully crafted narrative about resilience and transformation. Ashley's amateur attempts would destroy the cohesion I'd fought so hard to achieve. "Derek, this isn't about family politics," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "This is about professional integrity. My reputation is on the line tonight, And I won't compromise the collection for anyone. Ashley's eyes filled with crocodile tears, a tactic that had manipulated Derek since they were children. See? She doesn't care about family at all. She's always been jealous of my creativity. That's enough, Derek snapped, but his anger was directed at me, not his sister. Emma, you're being selfish and short-sighted. This is bigger than your artistic ego. I stared at my husband, really looking at him for the first time in months. When had he stopped seeing me as an equal partner and started treating me like an obstacle to manage? When had my dreams become negotiable while his sister's delusions were treated as precious commodities? I'm not changing the lineup, I said firmly. This collection stays as planned. Derek's expression shifted into something I'd never seen before, cold calculation mixed with genuine anger. Fine, have it your way, Emma. But don't expect me to clean up the mess when your stubbornness costs us everything. He grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door, Ashley trailing behind him like a loyal puppy. Derek, are you coming to watch the setup this afternoon? She called. Wouldn't miss it, he replied without looking back at me. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of final preparations. My assistant Rachel arrived early to help coordinate the transportation of garments to the venue. Each piece was carefully wrapped in protective covers and loaded into the specialized van I'd rented for the occasion. 27 pieces representing every style technique I'd mastered, every late night I'd spent perfecting details that most people would never notice. The convention center buzzed with controlled chaos as various designers prepared for their shows. My time slot was prime, 8 o'clock on Friday evening, when the fashion press would be alert and the wealthy patrons would arrive fresh from their champagne dinners. I'd fought for this spot, proved myself worthy through smaller shows and trunk sales that had gradually built my reputation in Miami's competitive fashion scene. Backstage felt like a pressure cooker. Models arrived for their final fittings, hair and makeup artists set up their stations, and photographers captured behind-the-scenes content for social media. I moved through the controlled chaos with practiced efficiency, checking each garment one final time before hanging them in order of appearance. The collection told the story of metamorphosis through fabric and form. It opened with structured pieces in muted earth tones, representing constraint and conformity. The middle section exploded with color and movement, flowing fabrics that seemed to dance with each step. The finale featured 7 evening gowns that seemed to capture light itself, each one more breathtaking than the last. My favorite piece was the closing gown, a creation I'd secretly named Phoenix. The base was deep midnight blue, but as light hit the fabric, it revealed layers of gold and crimson that seemed to emerge from within. The construction had taken me 4 months, with hand-sewn beadwork that created the illusion of flames rising from the hem toward the bodice. It was meant to be worn by Valentina, a stunning model with dark hair who moved like liquid poetry. Derek arrived at 5 o'clock with Ashley in tow, both dressed as if they were attending the show as guests rather than family members. Ashley wore a simple black dress that probably cost more than some people's cars, while Derek had changed into an even more expensive suit than his morning choice. Everything looks professional, Derek said, surveying the backstage area with the critical eye he usually reserved for property investments. Good turnout expected tonight? 300 confirmed guests, I replied, focused on steaming a jacket that had developed a small wrinkle during transport. Several fashion bloggers, buyers from 2 major department stores, and a journalist from Vogue. Ashley's eyes lit up at the mention of Vogue. Oh, Emma, this would be perfect timing to include my pieces. Imagine the exposure for our family brand. There is no family brand, I said without looking up from the steamer. This is my collection. My show, my moment. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Derek stepped closer, lowering his voice to the tone he used during business negotiations when he was about to destroy someone's position. Emma, I'm going to say this once more. Including Ashley's work would be a smart business decision. It would show that you're a team player, someone who understands that success is about relationships, not just individual talent. And I'm telling you once more that it's not happening, I replied, finally meeting his gaze. This collection has artistic integrity that I won't compromise. Ashley's face crumpled into practiced devastation. Fine, Emma. But don't come crying to us when your career stalls because you refuse to help family. They left without another word, and I tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in my stomach. In less than 3 hours, I would present the work that could define my entire future. Nothing else mattered except ensuring every detail was perfect. The models arrived at 6:30 for hair and makeup. I watched them transform under the skilled hands of the glam squad, becoming living embodiments of the vision I'd carried for 3 years. Each woman understood her role in the story, the emotion she needed to convey as she moved down the runway. By 7:45, guests were filing into their seats beyond the curtained backdrop. I could hear the low hum of conversation, the clink of champagne glasses, the rustle of programs being distributed. My heart hammered against my ribs as I made final adjustments to the model's accessories and reviewed the music cues with the sound technician. 5 minutes, Miss Rodriguez, the show coordinator announced. I gathered the models for our traditional pre-show huddle. Ladies, you are about to tell a story of transformation and strength. Remember, this isn't just about the clothes. You're embodying the journey from constraint to freedom. Own that runway like you own your lives. The lights dimmed in the audience area, and the opening music began. Model after model walked past me toward the runway entrance, and I felt the familiar mixture of terror and exhilaration that came with releasing my work into the world. The first 3 models returned backstage, glowing with adrenaline, whispering about the audience's positive response. The 4th and 5th pieces received enthusiastic applause that I could hear clearly through the backdrop. Everything was proceeding flawlessly. Then came the scream. Model number 6, wearing a flowing emerald dress that represented the beginning of transformation, stumbled back through the curtain with her hands pressed to her chest. The bodice of the dress had been slashed vertically, creating a gaping wound in the fabric that exposed her undergarments. What happened? I rushed to her side, my mind racing through possible explanations. Had she caught the fabric on something? Was there a structural failure in the construction? Someone cut it, she gasped, pointing toward the staging area where the remaining models waited for their cues. I felt the fabric separate just as I reached the runway entrance. I ran toward the back of the staging area, where 17 more models stood in various states of undress. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Trying to assess damage to their garments. The sight that greeted me will haunt me for the rest of my life. Every single remaining dress had been systematically destroyed. Not torn accidentally or damaged through careless handling, but deliberately cut with what must have been an extremely sharp instrument. Some had single slashes across the bodice, others were shredded beyond recognition. My phoenix gown lay in tatters, the hand-sewn beadwork scattered across the floor like fallen stars. The models stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to pity. In the space of minutes, my career-defining moment had become a career-ending disaster. The audience beyond the curtain was waiting for the next model to appear, unaware that there would be no continuation of the show. Ladies, I'm so sorry, I managed to whisper, my voice breaking as the full scope of the sabotage registered. Please, change into your street clothes. The show is over. That's when I saw him. Derek stood near the back exit, his expression carefully neutral, as he watched me discover the ruins of my life's work. Our eyes met across the devastation, and in that moment, I knew exactly who had orchestrated this destruction. My husband, the man who shared my bed, my dreams, my bank accounts, had methodically destroyed every piece of my collection, rather than allow me to refuse his sister's demands. He had brought scissors or a knife into my workspace and spent precious minutes cutting through fabric, beadwork, and my faith in our marriage. The show coordinator appeared at my elbow, his face pale with concern. Miss Rodriguez, we need to make an announcement to the audience. What should I tell them? I looked at Derek one more time, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in our 7-year relationship. He wasn't panicked or apologetic or even surprised by the disaster. He was satisfied. Tell them there's been a technical difficulty and the show is canceled, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Offer them champagne and catered appetizers with our apologies. As guests filed out of the venue, many stopping to express sympathy for what they assumed was an unforeseeable catastrophe. I stood among the ruins of my dreams and finally understood what Derek had been trying to teach me. In his world, compliance was rewarded and resistance was punished. Family loyalty meant Ashley's mediocrity would always be protected, while my excellence was expendable. The revelation should have broken me. Instead, it lit something dangerous and powerful in my chest. Derek thought he had taught me a lesson about the consequences of defying him. What he had actually done was show me exactly who he really was, and more importantly, who I refused to be. 3 hours later, I sat in our pristine penthouse, surrounded by the remnants of my collection, each piece a reminder of Derek's calculated cruelty. He and Ashley had gone to an after-party, celebrating what they probably saw as a necessary correction to my attitude. I pulled out my laptop and began researching bus schedules to anywhere but Miami. If Derek thought destroying my work would force me back into submission, he had fundamentally misunderstood what he had unleashed. The woman who had compromised her artistic vision to keep peace in the family was gone, cut away as cleanly as the fabric of my dresses. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new possibilities, and a chance to discover who Emma Rodriguez could become when she stopped asking permission to exist. The Greyhound station at 4 a.m. felt like the waiting room for broken dreams. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across plastic chairs occupied by people who looked as displaced as I felt. My single suitcase contained what little I could carry: 3 changes of clothes, my sketchbook, a few pieces of jewelry Derek hadn't bought for me, and the emergency cash I'd hidden in an old tampon box for years. $732. That's what remained of my independence fund, money I'd secretly accumulated by selling small accessories and vintage pieces I'd redesigned. Derek monitored our joint accounts obsessively, questioning every purchase above $50, but he'd never thought to investigate my feminine hygiene products. The irony wasn't lost on me now. The ticket agent, a tired-looking woman with graying roots and kind eyes, studied my face with concern. "Where you headed, honey?" I stared at the departure board, destinations blurring together through tears I refused to shed. Orlando. Jacksonville. Atlanta. Asheville. The names meant nothing to me, just points on a map far enough from Miami to matter. Asheville, I said, choosing the furthest destination my budget could handle. One way. That's a beautiful area, she said, counting my crumpled bills. Lots of artists up there. You'll like the mountains. Artists. The word hit me with unexpected force. When had I stopped thinking of myself as an artist? Somewhere between Derek's first criticism of my impractical designs and Ashley's constant need for validation, I'd begun introducing myself as Derek's wife, who dabbled in fashion rather than a designer with serious intentions. The bus wouldn't depart for 2 hours, giving me time to reconsider what I was doing. I could return to the penthouse, apologize for overreacting, promise to include Ashley in future projects. Derek would accept my surrender graciously, probably even suggest we take a vacation to help me recover from the stress of the failed show. Life would return to its carefully controlled patterns. My phone buzzed with a text message from Derek. "When you're done with this tantrum, we need to discuss damage control. Ashley's upset about how you treated her tonight." I read the message 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of manipulation. Not a single word of apology for destroying my work, no acknowledgement of the devastation he'd caused. Just concern for Ashley's feelings and a dismissive reduction of my reaction to a tantrum. I typed and deleted 6 responses before settling on silence. Instead, I opened my banking app and transferred every penny from our joint savings account to my personal checking account. Derek had always insisted on joint finances for transparency, but he'd overlooked the fact that joint meant I had equal access to funds I'd helped accumulate through years of unpaid labor managing his social calendar and household. The transfer went through immediately, $43,000. Enough to disappear properly, to buy time to figure out who I could become, without his constant oversight and criticism. My phone exploded with calls and texts as Derek discovered the financial reality of my departure. I turned it off and slipped it into the bottom of my suitcase. Whatever angry messages he left could wait until I was ready to hear them. The bus ride to Asheville took 14 hours, with multiple stops in small southern towns I'd never heard of. I pressed my face against the window and watched Florida's flat landscape gradually give way to rolling hills, then proper mountains covered in trees just beginning to show autumn colors. Each mile increased the distance between my old life and whatever came next. My fellow passengers changed with each stop. Families visiting relatives, college students returning to school, workers traveling between jobs that barely paid enough to survive. I listened to fragments of conversations and realized how isolated my life with Derek had become. When had I last spoken to someone who worried about making rent or choosing between groceries and gasoline? By the time we reached Asheville, my neck ached from sleeping against the window and my stomach cramped from surviving on vending machine snacks. The mountain air felt crisp and clean compared to Miami's humid heat, and I could smell wood smoke and something earthy I couldn't identify. The downtown area charmed me immediately with its mixture of historic buildings and modern shops. Street musicians played on corners, while people in layers of casual clothing browsed outdoor markets. Everyone seemed to move at a different pace than Miami's frantic energy. No one wore designer labels or spoke into Bluetooth headsets about million-dollar deals. I found a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, a family-owned place with worn carpet and furniture from the 1980s. The elderly man at the front desk accepted cash without asking questions, though his eyes lingered on my designer handbag with curiosity. "First time in Asheville?" he asked, handing me a room key attached to a plastic mountain keychain. "Yes, I'm not sure how long I'll be staying." "Take your time figuring it out," he said with a smile that seemed genuine. Mountains have a way of helping folks sort through their troubles. The room smelled like industrial air freshener and old cigarettes, but it was clean and private. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed myself to cry properly for the first time since discovering the destruction of my collection. Not delicate tears that wouldn't smudge my makeup, but ugly sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. I cried for the 3 years of work Derek had destroyed in minutes. I cried for the relationships I'd lost by gradually isolating myself to avoid his criticisms of my friends. I cried for the naive woman who'd believed marriage meant partnership instead of ownership. When the tears finally stopped, I felt hollowed out but somehow lighter. The crushing weight of trying to maintain Derek's version of perfection had lifted, leaving space for possibilities I couldn't yet imagine. Over the next 3 days, I explored Asheville like a tourist in my own life. I walked through neighborhoods filled with craftsman houses and artist studios, ate at restaurants where servers wore tattoos and vintage clothing, and discovered bookstores that stayed open late and encouraged customers to linger. The River Arts District fascinated me most. Converted warehouses housed dozens of studios where artists worked with glass, clay, metal, and fabric. I spent hours watching a weaver at her loom, mesmerized by the rhythm of her movements and the way colors emerged from her careful planning. "You look like you understand textiles," she said during a break, noticing how closely I'd been studying her work. "I used to design clothing," I admitted, "before everything fell apart." She studied my face with the direct gaze I was learning to associate with mountain people. "Things fall apart so better things can grow in their place. Are you looking for work?" The question caught me off guard. Work in this context meant something completely different than the networking and social climbing that had defined my Miami existence. Here, work seemed to mean creating something with your hands, contributing to a community, building skills that had tangible value. "I don't know what I'm looking for yet," I said honestly. "Well, when you figure it out, there's always room for good people in the arts community. We take care of each other here." That evening, I calculated my remaining funds with growing anxiety. The motel cost $60 per night, food was adding up faster than expected, and I had no income prospects. At this rate, my money would last maybe 6 weeks. Not enough time to establish a new life, barely enough to figure out what that life might look like. I needed to find cheaper accommodation and some way to earn money while I sorted through my options. The classified ads in the local newspaper yielded nothing promising. Restaurant work required experience I didn't have, retail positions wanted references I couldn't provide, and office jobs assumed skills I'd never developed. Derek had always handled everything beyond our social calendar. He'd insisted it was more efficient that way, freeing me to focus on my creative pursuits. Now I realized how thoroughly he'd kept me dependent, incapable of navigating basic adult responsibilities without his oversight. My phone had been charging in the motel room for 2 days, accumulating voicemails and text messages I wasn't ready to confront. Finally, curiosity overcame my reluctance. Derek's messages followed a predictable pattern: anger, threats, manipulation, false concern, and finally, cold business calculations. "Emma, this is ridiculous. Come home, and we'll work through this together. You've stolen money that doesn't belong to you. I could have you arrested. Ashley's been crying for days because of how you treated her. Is this really the person you want to be? Fine, stay gone, but you'll come crawling back when reality hits and you realize you can't survive without me. I've spoken to a lawyer. You're entitled to nothing beyond what I choose to give you. Remember that." The progression from loving husband to calculated adversary happened faster than I'd expected. Within 4 days, Derek had revealed his true assessment of our relationship, a business arrangement where he provided financial security in exchange for my compliance and unpaid labor. But one voicemail stood out from the rest. My old college roommate, Jessica, had somehow heard about the fashion show disaster through industry gossip. "Emma, honey, I don't know what happened at your show, but I heard it was awful. Call me if you need anything. I mean anything. You don't have to face whatever this is alone." I stared at the phone for an hour before finally calling her back. Jessica lived in Portland now, running a small boutique that specialized in sustainable fashion. We'd lost touch gradually after college. Not through any conflict, but through the slow drift that happens when lives take different directions. "Emma, oh my God, I've been so worried. Where are you? Are you okay?" The concern in her voice almost started fresh tears. "I'm in Asheville. I left Derek. I left everything." "Good for you," she said without hesitation. "That man was suffocating you slowly. I could see it happening every time we talked, the way you second-guessed every opinion, asked permission for things that should have been your own decisions. You never said anything. Would you have listened? Sometimes people have to figure out their own cage before they can find the door." We talked for 2 hours, and Jessica offered to wire me money, provide references for work, even let me stay with her in Portland. Her generosity overwhelmed me, but I found myself declining her offers. "I need to figure this out myself," I explained. "I've been rescued by other people my whole life. First my parents, then Derek. I need to know I can stand on my own." "I understand. But promise me you'll call if you get desperate. Pride is fine until it becomes stupid." After hanging up, I realized something had shifted during our conversation. For the first time since leaving Miami, I'd spoken about my situation without shame or apology. Jessica's matter-of-fact acceptance of my decision to leave Derek helped me see my choice as reasonable rather than rash. I spent the next morning exploring neighborhoods further from downtown, looking for cheaper housing options. The bulletin board at a natural foods cooperative was covered with offers for house sitting, room rentals, and work trade arrangements. One posting caught my attention. Small apartment above alteration shop available in exchange for help with sewing projects. Perfect for someone with textile skills looking for a fresh start. The address led me to a narrow building wedged between a vintage bookstore and a shop selling handmade pottery. The ground floor housed Santos Alterations, with a hand-painted sign that had clearly been lovingly maintained for years. Through the window, I could see an older woman bent over a sewing machine, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled back in a practical bun. I stood outside for 10 minutes, gathering courage to knock. This felt like a test I couldn't afford to fail. My remaining money would last another month at most, and winter was approaching in the mountains. I needed this to work. The woman looked up when I entered, her brown eyes kind but cautious. The shop smelled like fabric softener, and the particular mix of oils that kept old sewing machines running smoothly. Racks of clothing waiting for repairs lined the walls, everything from formal gowns to work uniforms. "Can I help you?" she asked in accented English, setting down the jacket she'd been hemming. I saw your sign about the apartment. I'm looking for housing and I have experience with sewing. She studied me carefully, taking in my appearance with the practiced eye of someone who understood clothing construction. My designer jeans and silk blouse probably cost more than she charged for a month of alterations. But she didn't seem judgmental. Just curious. What kind of experience? I could have lied, claimed more practical skills than I possessed. Instead, I chose honesty. I designed high-end clothing in Miami, custom pieces, some runway work. But I don't have experience with basic alterations or commercial sewing. I'm willing to learn if you're willing to teach. Something in my voice must have conveyed my desperation because her expression softened. I'm Maria Santos. This is my shop. My husband Carlos and I have been here 15 years. She gestured toward the back room where I could hear someone moving around. Why are you here instead of Miami? The question demanded truth. I could feel we were past the point where casual lies would work. My husband destroyed my career to punish me for refusing to compromise my artistic vision. I left with almost nothing and I'm trying to figure out how to start over. Maria nodded slowly as if my story made perfect sense to her. Carlos, she called toward the back room. Come meet someone. A compact man with graying hair and paint-stained fingers emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. He shared Maria's direct gaze and carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd built something meaningful with his own efforts. This is Emma, Maria explained in Spanish, speaking too quickly for me to follow. Carlos responded in the same language, his tone questioning but not hostile. Carlos thinks you look too fancy for alteration work, Maria translated with a small smile. I told him desperate doesn't care about fancy. I am desperate, I admitted. But I'm also a hard worker when someone gives me a chance. Carlos studied me for another moment before speaking in careful English. Show me your hands. I extended my hands, palms up. He examined them critically, noting the softness that came from years of Derek's insistence on professional manicures and avoidance of manual labor. Soft now, he said, but good fingers for detail work. Maria teaches you, you work hard, apartment is yours. Relief flooded through me so intensely I felt dizzy. Thank you. I won't disappoint you. People disappoint themselves, Maria said pragmatically. Come, I show you the apartment. The space above the shop was small but charming, with exposed brick walls and large windows that let in afternoon light. The furniture was simple but comfortable, and the tiny kitchen contained everything necessary for basic cooking. After the sterile perfection of Derek's penthouse, the apartment felt warm and welcoming. Rent is help in shop plus $200 monthly for utilities, Maria explained. You start tomorrow, 6 days per week, Sundays for rest and whatever else you need to do. What about the sewing skills I don't have yet? Maria smiled, the first completely unguarded expression I'd seen from her. Nobody is born knowing how to hem pants or replace zippers. But you learn fast or you find different work. Is fair, yes? It was more than fair. It was a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in uncertainty. That night, I moved my few possessions into the apartment and made my first meal in the tiny kitchen. Pasta with store-brand sauce. But I felt more satisfaction preparing it than I'd experienced eating at Miami's most exclusive restaurants. I called Derek from the apartment's landline, using the number Maria had said I could access for emergencies. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting by the phone. Emma? Where the hell are you? I'm safe, I'm working, and I'm not coming back. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Working at what? You have no practical skills, no references, no real work experience. You'll be back within a month, begging for forgiveness. Maybe. But it will be my choice to come back, not desperation. I filed for divorce, he said, his tone shifting to the cold efficiency he used for business negotiations. You'll get whatever the prenup stipulates and nothing more. I hope your pride keeps you warm when you're living in some trailer park. The prenup. I'd forgotten about the document Derek's lawyer had insisted I sign before our wedding. Back when I was too in love to question why my husband-to-be needed legal protection from my potential financial claims. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable precaution for a successful man marrying someone with minimal assets. "I understand," I said simply. "Do you? Because this is your last chance to come home and fix this. After the divorce is final, there's no going back." "I'm counting on that," I replied, and hung up before he could respond. I stood in my tiny new kitchen, surrounded by borrowed furniture, and the smell of someone else's cooking from downstairs, and realized I felt more at home than I had in years. Derek was right about my lack of practical skills and real work experience. He was probably right about the financial hardship that lay ahead. But he was wrong about one crucial thing. This wasn't about pride. This was about discovering whether the woman I used to be still existed somewhere beneath years of careful conditioning and gradual surrender. Tomorrow, I would start learning skills Derek had always insisted I didn't need. I would build something with my own hands, earn money through my own efforts, and find out what independence actually felt like. The mountain air drifted through my open window, carrying the scent of wood smoke and autumn leaves. In Miami, I'd lived in climate-controlled perfection, never feeling the changing seasons or the natural rhythms that connected people to the world around them. For the first time since discovering my destroyed collection, I opened my sketchbook and began to draw. Not designs for the kind of customer who demanded perfection and paid premium prices, but ideas for clothing that served real people living real lives. Work clothes that could transition to evening wear. Jackets that protected against mountain weather while maintaining feminine lines. Dresses that flattered normal bodies instead of requiring impossible proportions. The sketches flowed from my pencil faster than they had in years. Without Derek's constant criticism and Ashley's need for validation, my creativity felt unleashed from constraints I'd forgotten were there. I drew until my hand cramped and my eyes grew heavy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new humiliations as I struggled to master skills most people learned in high school home economics classes. But tonight, surrounded by the tools of my trade and the promise of honest work, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. My first morning at Santos Alterations began at 6:30 when Maria knocked on my apartment door with a cup of coffee and a no-nonsense expression that suggested my education was about to begin, whether I felt ready or not. The coffee was stronger than anything Derek had ever allowed in our kitchen, and it tasted like purpose. "Today you learn the basics," Maria said, handing me a canvas apron that smelled like years of honest work. Hemming, taking in seams, replacing buttons. Simple things, but they must be perfect. Customer pays for perfect. The shop's main floor buzzed with activity, as Carlos arranged pressed garments on hangers, while Maria sorted through the day's intake. 3 industrial sewing machines hummed along one wall, their steady rhythm creating a soundtrack that felt oddly comforting. Natural light streamed through large windows, illuminating work tables covered with measuring tools, pins and spools of thread in every color imaginable. "First lesson," Maria said, leading me to the smallest sewing machine. This machine is 30 years old, but she works better than anything modern because we maintain her properly. Machines are like relationships. Neglect them and they break when you need them most. She demonstrated the machine's quirks with practiced ease, showing me how to adjust tension for different fabrics, how to guide material through the presser foot without creating puckers, and how to backstitch for secure seams. Her hands moved with the confidence that comes from decades of repetition, making complex adjustments look effortless. "Your turn," she said, stepping back and gesturing toward a pile of practice fabric. My first attempts were disastrous. The thread bunched underneath the fabric, creating birds' nests of tangled mess. The seams wandered drunkenly across the material, ignoring my attempts at straight lines. After 20 minutes, I'd managed to create several pieces of fabric that looked like they'd been attacked by an angry cat. "Is normal," Maria said, examining my failures without judgment. "High fashion and alterations use different muscles. You know theory, now you learn practice." Carlos appeared at my elbow with a measuring tape and a jacket that needed shortening. "Show me how you measure for hem," he said in his careful English. I knelt beside the customer, a middle-aged woman who worked at the local hospital, and attempted to measure the desired length while she stood patiently. My hands shook slightly as I marked the fabric with pins, acutely aware that this woman's professional appearance depended on my accuracy. "More pins," Carlos instructed. Every 2 inches, all around, fabric moves. Pins keep it honest. The measuring process took 3 times longer than it should have, but Carlos waited patiently while I corrected mistakes and learned to account for the way fabric behaved differently when the customer moved. When I finally finished, he examined my pin placement with the same intensity Derek had once reserved for architectural blueprints. Good enough for learning, he pronounced, but not good enough for customer. Try again. The second attempt went smoother, and by the third I began to understand the relationship between precision and customer satisfaction. This wasn't about artistic vision or creative expression. It was about solving practical problems for people who trusted us with their everyday needs. Over the following weeks, I developed a routine that grounded me in ways my previous life never had. Morning coffee with Maria, while we reviewed the day's projects. Hours spent mastering techniques that required patience and attention to detail, rather than creative genius. Lunch breaks where Carlos taught me basic Spanish, while we ate sandwiches from the deli next door. Afternoons helping customers who appreciated competent service more than revolutionary design. The work challenged muscles I'd forgotten I possessed. My back ached from bending over the sewing machine, my fingers grew calloused from handling pins and needles, and my eyes strained from focusing on tiny stitches for hours at a time. But the physical discomfort felt cleansing after years of Derek's mental manipulation and control. Mrs. Patterson, a retired teacher who brought in her late husband's shirts to be converted into quilting squares, became my first regular customer. Her initial skepticism about the fancy new girl gradually transformed into patient mentorship as I learned to handle delicate fabrics without damaging them. "You're getting better," she observed one afternoon, watching me carefully remove buttons from a vintage dress shirt. "Your hands are steadier now, more confident." The compliment meant more to me than any praise I'd received for my high-fashion designs. Mrs. Patterson's approval came from honest assessment of practical skills, not social obligation or business networking. My relationship with Maria deepened as we worked side by side, communicating through a mixture of English, Spanish, and the universal language of shared labor. She never asked about my past beyond what I'd already revealed, but her occasional comments revealed a woman who understood disappointment and reinvention. "I was teacher in El Salvador," she mentioned one day while showing me how to reinforce buttonholes. "Literature, poetry, all the beautiful words. But beautiful words don't pay rent in America, so I learned different beauty. Thread and fabric, making people feel good in their clothes. Do you miss teaching? Every day. But missing something and regretting choices are different feelings. I chose Carlos, chose America, chose this work. Missing is just memory having feelings." Her philosophical approach to life's unexpected turns resonated with my own struggle to make sense of recent changes. Derek had trained me to view any deviation from plan as failure, but Maria treated adaptability as a necessary life skill. Carlos proved equally educational in his own way. A former carpenter whose arthritis had forced career changes, he brought craftsmanship principles to alteration work that elevated simple repairs into small works of art. He taught me to see clothing construction as architecture, where every seam served structural as well as aesthetic purposes. "Quality is in details nobody notices until they're wrong," he explained, while showing me how to properly align stripes when taking in a blazer. "Customer doesn't see good work, only feels confident wearing clothes that fit correctly." His patience with my learning curve seemed infinite, though I suspected he'd seen plenty of beginners struggle with the transition from theory to practice. When I finally mastered the technique for invisible mending on wool fabric, his approving nod felt like graduation from apprentice to competent helper. The shop's customers provided daily lessons in human nature and social dynamics that my previous life had never exposed me to. Working mothers who needed uniforms altered between demanding jobs and evening classes. Elderly men whose bodies had changed but whose attachment to favorite garments remained strong. Teenagers preparing for school dances who couldn't afford new dresses but could transform thrift store finds into perfect outfits with strategic alterations. Each interaction taught me something about resilience, creativity within constraints, and the difference between want and need. These people approached clothing as functional necessity rather than status symbol, but their satisfaction with well-executed work proved that quality mattered regardless of price point. One particularly busy Saturday, A woman my age arrived with an armload of professional clothing that no longer fit properly after pregnancy. Her exhaustion was visible as she struggled to keep her toddler entertained while explaining which pieces were most important for her upcoming return to work. "I know it's a lot," she apologized, "but I can't afford new clothes right now, and these need to work for at least another year." I spent extra time with her, suggesting modifications that would provide more adjustability and explaining which alterations would give her the most professional impact for her budget. When she returned the following week to pick up the finished pieces, her transformation was remarkable. The properly fitted clothing restored her confidence in ways that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with feeling prepared for professional challenges. "You saved my sanity," she said while paying her bill. "I actually feel like myself again instead of someone wearing her older sister's clothes." The interaction reminded me why I'd originally been drawn to fashion design: the power of clothing to affect how people felt about themselves and moved through the world. Derek had gradually pushed me toward increasingly esoteric designs that impressed other designers but had little connection to real people's lives. Here, every day brought opportunities to solve actual problems for people who genuinely needed what we offered. My evenings developed their own rhythm. After closing the shop, I'd climb to my apartment and practice new techniques on scraps of fabric Maria saved for me. The mechanical nature of the work proved meditative, allowing my mind to process the day's lessons while my hands gained muscle memory for different stitches and construction methods. I also began exploring Asheville's creative community, discovering a network of artists and makers who supported each other's work without the competitive edge that had characterized Miami's fashion scene. Linda Chen, who owned the vintage shop next door, introduced me to monthly gatherings where local artisans shared techniques and collaborated on projects. "You should come to the next fiber art circle," Linda suggested one evening as we chatted outside our buildings. "It's mostly quilters and weavers, but they always welcome new perspectives." The fiber arts group met in a converted warehouse space that housed several artist studios. 20 women of various ages sat in a circle, working on individual projects while discussing everything from dyeing techniques to business strategies. The atmosphere felt supportive rather than judgmental, with experienced artisans freely sharing knowledge with beginners. I brought a small embroidery project I'd been experimenting with, adding decorative details to basic garments as a way to practice hand stitching. The group's feedback was constructive and encouraging, offering suggestions for different thread types and stitching patterns that could enhance my designs. "That's beautiful work," said Sophia, a weaver who created stunning scarves from locally sourced wool. "Have you considered selling pieces like this at the farmer's market? There's always demand for unique accessories." The suggestion planted a seed I wasn't ready to nurture yet, but it reminded me that creativity could exist outside the high-pressure environment Derek had insisted was necessary for serious artistic work. These women created beautiful, functional items without gallery representation or Fashion Week validation, finding satisfaction in craftsmanship and community connection. My Spanish vocabulary expanded rapidly through daily interactions with Maria and Carlos, who switched languages depending on the complexity of what they needed to communicate. Carlos particularly enjoyed teaching me construction terms, proud when I correctly identified different types of interfacing or remembered the names for various sewing machine attachments. "Your pronunciation is terrible," Maria teased one afternoon after I'd mispronounced overlock in Spanish for the third time. "But your understanding is good. Language is like sewing. Practice makes perfect, but perfect isn't required for useful." Their acceptance of my imperfections contrasted sharply with Derek's constant corrections and Ashley's competitive need to excel in every area. Here, mistakes were learning opportunities rather than personal failures, and progress mattered more than perfection. As autumn deepened into early winter, I realized my hands had changed completely. The soft, manicured fingers Derek had admired were gone, replaced by capable hands marked with small scars from needles and pins, calloused from handling rough fabrics, strong enough to wrestle reluctant zippers into submission. When I caught sight of them holding a seam ripper or guiding fabric through the machine, I barely recognized them as my own. The transformation extended beyond my hands. My body had grown stronger from the physical demands of alteration work, my posture improved from hours of focused concentration, and my overall health benefited from walking to work instead of driving everywhere. Even my sleep improved, the deep rest that comes from physical exhaustion replacing the anxious insomnia that had plagued me during my final months with Derek. More significantly, my relationship with clothing itself had evolved. Instead of viewing garments as artistic statements or status symbols, I began to appreciate them as problem-solving tools. A well-fitted jacket that boosted someone's confidence for a job interview mattered more than a conceptual design that impressed critics but served no practical purpose. This shift in perspective sparked new creative directions. I began sketching designs that prioritized function alongside beauty, imagining clothing that would serve the customers I met daily rather than the abstract fashion ideals Derek had always promoted. Work dresses with hidden pockets for busy mothers, blazers with strategic stretch panels for women whose bodies didn't match standard sizing, accessories that could transform day looks into evening wear for people who couldn't afford separate wardrobes. The sketches felt more honest than anything I'd designed in years, rooted in real needs rather than theoretical concepts. When I showed some drawings to Sophia at the Fiber Arts Group, her enthusiasm surprised me. "These are incredible," she said, studying a design for a reversible jacket that could adapt to different professional environments. "You should seriously consider producing some of these. I know at least 5 women who would buy that jacket immediately." "I don't have the resources for production," I explained. "These are just ideas." "Ideas don't have to stay ideas forever," she replied. "Start small, build gradually. That's how most of us started our businesses." The word business still felt foreign when applied to my creative work. Derek had always managed the commercial aspects of my design career, insisting that artists shouldn't worry about money because it corrupted creative vision. Now I realized his control over finances had been another form of dependency, keeping me focused on artistic pursuits while he maintained power over practical decisions. But the seed Sophia had planted continued growing. During quiet moments at the shop, I found myself calculating costs for materials and labor, imagining how I might produce small quantities of custom pieces. Maria noticed my increased interest in business operations and began explaining their pricing structure and customer acquisition strategies. "You have good eye for what people need," she observed one day while I helped a customer select fabric for recovering vintage chair cushions. "That's rarer than technical skill. Technical skill can be taught, but understanding what serves people comes from different place." Her confidence in my abilities felt revolutionary after years of Derek's subtle undermining. When customers complimented my work or asked specifically for my help with challenging projects, I began to internalize the possibility that I might genuinely possess valuable skills. The holiday season brought increased business to the shop as people prepared for celebrations and professional events. I learned to handle the pressure of deadlines while maintaining quality standards, developing efficiency without sacrificing attention to detail. The work tested my growing abilities while building confidence in my capacity to meet commitments and solve problems independently. Christmas Eve found me alone in my apartment for the first time since arriving in Nashville. Maria and Carlos had driven to Charlotte to spend the holiday with their extended family, and the shop sat quiet below my windows. Snow had begun falling that afternoon, transforming the mountain town into something from a holiday card. I made simple dinner and sat by my window, watching snow accumulate on the street below while reflecting on the past few months. 6 months ago, I'd been Derek's wife, living in climate-controlled luxury while slowly surrendering pieces of my identity to maintain relationship harmony. Now I lived above an alteration shop, my hands bore the marks of honest work, and my savings account contained money I'd earned through my own efforts. The contrast should have depressed me, especially during a season associated with family and tradition. Instead, I felt more content than I had in years. The solitude felt peaceful rather than lonely, and the simplicity of my current life had revealed how much complexity Derek had insisted was necessary for happiness. My phone, which I'd finally begun checking regularly again, contained the usual holiday messages from acquaintances and a longer email from Jessica checking on my progress. I composed a response that surprised me with its optimism, describing my work at the shop and the satisfaction of mastering practical skills. "I'm learning that there's dignity in work that serves people directly," I wrote. "Every day brings small victories. A hem that hangs perfectly, a customer who feels confident in clothes that fit properly, a technique mastered after dozens of failed attempts. It's not the life I planned, but it's a life I'm building with my own choices." As midnight approached, I realized I hadn't thought about Derek or Ashley in several days. The constant mental rehearsal of grievances and imaginary conversations had faded, replaced by immediate concerns like perfecting my buttonhole technique and planning the shop's inventory for the new year. The divorce papers had arrived the week before, requiring my signature on documents that would formally end my marriage. I'd read through them carefully, noting Derek's lawyer's efficiency in minimizing my financial claims while protecting his assets. The prenup would indeed limit my settlement to a modest sum, but I'd signed the papers without resentment. The woman who'd signed that prenup 7 years ago had believed financial security required surrendering autonomy. The woman sitting in this mountain apartment had learned that autonomy might be worth more than security, and that financial independence could be built through daily choices rather than inherited through marriage. Snow continued falling outside my window, and I pulled a quilt around my shoulders while continuing to watch the peaceful street below. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as I continued learning skills that connected me to generations of women who'd built lives through practical creativity and careful craftsmanship. For the first time since Derek drove away laughing in that Italian town, I felt genuinely grateful for his betrayal. His cruelty had accidentally freed me from a life that was slowly erasing everything I'd once loved about myself. His attempt to teach me dependence had instead revealed my capacity for independence. The snow fell steadily through the night, covering the evidence of yesterday's footsteps and creating a clean slate for tomorrow's journey. I fell asleep planning the week's projects and thinking about spring, when I might finally be ready to plant something new in the fertile ground Derek's destruction had accidentally prepared. Spring arrived in Asheville with an explosion of color that transformed the mountain landscape into something almost magical. Dogwood trees bloomed white and pink along the streets, and the farmer's market expanded from its winter skeleton into a vibrant gathering place filled with fresh produce, handmade crafts, and live music. I found myself walking to work with lighter steps, energized by longer days and the sense that anything might be possible. My skills at the alteration shop had evolved from desperate fumbling to confident competence. Maria trusted me with the shop's most challenging customers, and I developed a reputation for creative solutions to complex fitting problems. When Mrs. Hendricks brought in her mother's vintage wedding dress that needed to be transformed for her daughter's ceremony, she specifically requested that I handle the delicate restoration work. The dress had been stored improperly for decades, with yellowed lace and structural damage that would have been easier to ignore than repair. But the family history embedded in every seam meant too much to treat carelessly. I spent weeks researching appropriate cleaning methods, sourcing matching vintage lace, and carefully reconstructing the bodice to accommodate modern undergarments, while preserving the gown's original character. "You've brought my mother back to life," Mrs. Hendricks said when she saw the finished dress, tears gathering in her eyes. "Sarah will be so honored to wear this, knowing it's been made beautiful again." The wedding took place on a perfect April afternoon, and I watched from the back of the small church as the bride moved down the aisle in the restored gown. The dress flowed like liquid silk, every detail perfectly executed, and I felt a pride that had nothing to do with recognition or financial reward. This was craftsmanship in service of love, artistry that honored family bonds across generations. Sophia had been persistent about encouraging my original design work, and spring brought an opportunity that forced me to consider possibilities I'd been avoiding. The Asheville Arts Council announced a juried craft fair, focused on sustainable fashion, with booth space available for emerging designers willing to demonstrate their techniques while selling their work. "You have to apply," Sophia insisted during our monthly fiber arts meeting. "Your sketches show exactly the kind of innovative thinking they're looking for, and you have the technical skills to execute your ideas properly." "I'm not ready for something that public," I protested. "I'm still learning basic construction techniques." "That's exactly why you should do it," chimed in Rebecca, a quilter who'd built a successful custom bedding business from her garage. "Nothing teaches you faster than having to deliver finished work to paying customers. Plus, the sustainable fashion angle is perfect for your aesthetic." The application deadline was 2 weeks away, requiring photos of finished pieces that demonstrated both design innovation and technical competence. I had plenty of sketches but no completed garments that represented my evolving vision for functional, beautiful clothing that served real women's lives. That evening, I spread my design notebooks across my apartment floor and tried to see my work objectively. The sketches had evolved significantly since my early days in Asheville, becoming more grounded in practical needs while maintaining the artistic sensibility that had always driven my creativity. Work dresses with hidden nursing panels for new mothers, blazers with removable shoulder pads that could transition from professional meetings to weekend activities, coats designed to accommodate layers during unpredictable mountain weather. The designs felt authentic in ways my Miami work never had, but translating them from paper to fabric would require skills I was still developing. More challenging, it would require the confidence to present my work for public judgment after Derek's systematic destruction of my professional credibility. I spent the weekend calculating costs and timelines, trying to determine whether producing even 3 pieces for the application was financially or practically feasible. The math was tight but manageable if I used my savings carefully and worked evenings after the shop closed. Maria had offered to let me use the shop's equipment for personal projects, and Carlos had volunteered to help with any construction challenges beyond my current abilities. Monday morning, I arrived at work with fabric samples and a tentative plan. Maria examined my sketches with the critical eye she brought to all technical assessments, asking pointed questions about construction methods and practical wearability. "This jacket design is smart," she said, studying a drawing for a blazer with convertible sleeves. "But seaming here will be a challenge for someone learning tailoring. Maybe start with simpler construction, add complexity later, when skills improve." Her feedback was exactly what I needed, honest assessment from someone who understood both design theory and manufacturing reality. Together, we modified my most ambitious sketches into versions that showcased innovation while remaining within my technical capabilities. Carlos proved equally valuable in helping me source materials that would keep costs reasonable while maintaining quality standards. His network of suppliers extended beyond the shop's usual vendors to include fabric mills and notions distributors who catered to small-scale independent designers. "Quality is in details, customer touches," he reminded me while we examined different weights of wool suiting. "Expensive fabric can't fix poor construction, but good construction makes affordable fabric feel luxurious." I chose fabrics that felt substantial and professional while remaining within my budget. Wool blends that had good drape without requiring extensive underlining, cotton shirting that would wear well and press easily, and hardware that looked expensive but cost less than premium options. The actual construction process pushed my skills in directions that purely alteration work hadn't required. Creating garments from scratch demanded understanding of how different pieces related to each other structurally, how to achieve professional-looking finishes, and how to solve problems that emerged during the building process. My first attempt at the convertible blazer revealed gaps in my knowledge that would have been humiliating 6 months earlier, but now felt like valuable learning opportunities. The collar didn't lie properly against the neckline, requiring multiple adjustments before I achieved the smooth line I'd envisioned. The sleeve attachment created puckers that had to be pressed out carefully to avoid damaging the fabric. "Is normal," Maria assured me when I expressed frustration with my slow progress. "Learning is not straight line. You try, you fail, you figure out better way, you try again. Each time, understanding grows deeper." Her patience with my learning curve reminded me why I'd flourished under her mentorship. Unlike Derek's approach of providing solutions without explanation, Maria taught me to analyze problems independently and develop my own solutions. When I struggled with achieving consistent buttonhole quality, she showed me 3 different techniques and let me discover which worked best for my particular motor skills and preferences. Evening work sessions in the quiet shop became meditation periods, where I could focus entirely on the rhythm of construction without external pressures or distractions. The mechanical aspects of sewing, measuring, cutting, stitching, pressing, required attention that quieted the mental chatter that had plagued me for years. My phone rarely interrupted these sessions, partly because few people had my new number, but mostly because I'd learned to value uninterrupted time for focused work. When Jessica called one evening to check on my progress, I realized I'd gone days without thinking about my previous life. "You sound different," she observed. "More grounded, more confident. Whatever you're doing is working." "I'm learning that I can build something myself instead of waiting for someone else to approve my choices," I explained, while hand-basting a sleeve that required precise alignment. It's slower than I expected, but every small success feels earned. Are you happy? Really happy, not just making the best of a bad situation? The question caught me off guard, because I hadn't been monitoring my emotional state systematically. Happiness felt too simple a term for the complex mixture of satisfaction, challenge, and possibility that characterized my daily experience. I'm engaged, I said finally. Everything I do matters in immediate, tangible ways. When I finish a project successfully, I can see the results and know I created something useful with my own skills. By late May, I'd completed 3 pieces that represented my design philosophy while demonstrating technical competence. The convertible blazer had evolved through multiple iterations into a sophisticated garment that could transition from boardroom to casual weekend wear with simple adjustments. A work dress incorporated subtle stretch panels and carefully placed seams that flattered various body types while maintaining professional appearance. The third piece, a lightweight coat designed for unpredictable weather, featured removable layers and adjustable details that allowed customization for different conditions. Photographing the finished garments required skills I'd never developed, but Linda from the vintage shop volunteered her expertise with styling and lighting. We spent an afternoon in her store's back garden, using natural light and simple backgrounds to showcase the clothing's design details and construction quality. "These are really impressive," Linda said while reviewing the photos on her camera. "The technical execution is solid, but more importantly, they solve real problems that women face. That's what separates good design from clever concepts." The application process forced me to articulate my design philosophy in writing, something I'd never been required to do during my Miami career. Derek had always handled marketing communications, reducing my work to buzzwords and commercial appeals that emphasize status rather than substance. Writing about my own work felt vulnerable but clarifying. I described clothing designed for women whose lives demanded both professionalism and practicality. Pieces that could adapt to multiple roles without sacrificing style or comfort. The sustainable fashion angle emerged naturally from my focus on timeless design and quality construction that would outlast trends. "I create clothing for women who need their wardrobes to work as hard as they do," I wrote in my artist statement. Every piece is designed to serve multiple functions, while maintaining the attention to detail that makes clothing a pleasure to wear rather than a daily compromise. The acceptance notification arrived in June, accompanied by booth assignment details and vendor information that made the opportunity feel suddenly real and intimidating. I would have 3 days to demonstrate my techniques, sell finished pieces, and interact with customers who expected professional competence and artistic vision. Maria and Carlos celebrated my acceptance with genuine enthusiasm, treating my success as validation of the mentorship they'd provided. The shop had become profitable enough to hire additional help, and they encouraged me to use the craft fair as a launching point for independent work. "You ready for business?" Carlos announced with characteristic directness. "Skills are good, ideas are smart, timing is right. Only question is if you believe in yourself enough to try." His confidence in my abilities felt both validating and terrifying. Starting my own business would mean leaving the security of regular employment for the uncertainty of entrepreneurial ventures. It would also mean competing directly with other designers in a market I didn't fully understand. But the craft fair provided a low-risk opportunity to test my work's commercial viability while learning about customer preferences and pricing strategies. I spent the summer creating additional pieces for sale, building an inventory that showcased my range while remaining within production capabilities. The work consumed my evenings and weekends, but the intensity felt energizing rather than overwhelming. Each completed piece represented problem-solving challenges that pushed my skills in new directions. When Rebecca commissioned a custom jacket for her daughter's college graduation, the project required adapting my standard blazer pattern for a teenager's proportions, while incorporating design elements that reflected the young woman's personality. "Mom, this is perfect," the daughter said during her final fitting, admiring how the jacket's tailored lines enhanced her figure while providing the professional appearance she needed for job interviews. "I feel like I could conquer the world in this." Her reaction reminded me why I'd originally been drawn to fashion design, the transformative power of clothing that fit properly and reflected the wearer's best self. Derek had gradually steered me toward increasingly abstract designs that impressed other designers but had minimal connection to how clothing actually functioned in people's lives. The craft fair took place during the first weekend of September, when early autumn colors were beginning to appear in the mountains and tourist season reached its peak. My booth space was strategically located near the fair's main entrance, with good visibility for demonstrations while providing enough room to display finished pieces effectively. Setting up required skills I'd never developed, from arranging merchandise to create visual appeal, to organizing pricing and payment systems. Linda had loaned me professional quality clothing racks and display fixtures, while Sophia provided advice about customer interaction and sales techniques. "Remember, you're not just selling clothing," Sophia counseled while helping me arrange pieces by color and style. "You're selling craftsmanship, problem solving, and the satisfaction of owning something created specifically for real women's needs." The first day brought steady crowds of browsers who were curious about the construction techniques I demonstrated while working on new pieces. Many visitors had never watched clothing being created by hand, and they asked detailed questions about pattern development, fabric selection, and finishing methods. "How long does it take to make a jacket like this?" asked a woman who'd been watching me install a lining with carefully matched seams. "About 20 hours of actual construction time," I explained, "but that doesn't include design development, pattern creation, or the multiple fittings required for proper customization." 20 hours? She seemed genuinely surprised by the time investment. I had no idea so much work went into a single garment. Her reaction was typical of customers who'd grown accustomed to mass-produced clothing that prioritized low costs over construction quality. Explaining my process helped them understand why handmade pieces commanded higher prices while providing value that extended far beyond initial purchase. Sales were steady but not overwhelming the first day, mostly accessories and simpler pieces that appealed to customers seeking unique items without major investment. The real test came when a woman tried on the convertible blazer I'd originally created for the application portfolio. "This is exactly what I've been looking for," she said, adjusting the color configuration to create a more casual silhouette. "I need pieces that can go from client meetings to dinner, without looking wrong in either setting." We spent 20 minutes discussing her wardrobe needs, her lifestyle requirements, and the modifications that would make the blazer perfect for her specific body type and professional demands. When she placed an order for a custom version in her preferred fabric and color, I felt a validation that had nothing to do with artistic recognition and everything to do with solving real problems for someone who genuinely needed what I offered. The second day brought more serious customers, including several women who'd heard about my work from previous buyers. Word of mouth proved more effective than any marketing strategy Derek had ever employed, with satisfied customers bringing friends who had similar needs and aesthetic preferences. A group of professional women from Asheville's medical community discovered my booth together, drawn by the practical design elements that addressed their specific workplace challenges. Scrubs were required during patient care, but administrative duties and professional meetings demanded business casual attire that could withstand long days and frequent movement. "Do you think you could create a dress that looks professional but has the comfort of athletic wear?" asked Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a pediatrician whose workday included everything from board meetings to crawling on examination room floors to comfort young patients. The challenge intrigued me both technically and conceptually. Medical professionals needed clothing that projected competence and authority, while providing the flexibility and durability their work demanded. Traditional business wear often prioritized appearance over function, creating daily compromises that affected both comfort and professional effectiveness. "I think I could design something that meets those requirements," I said, already sketching preliminary ideas on the notepad I kept for customer consultations. It would require some experimentation with fabric choices and construction techniques, but the basic concept is definitely feasible. Dr. Mitchell's enthusiasm for the project led to conversations with her colleagues, and by the end of the weekend, I had orders for 5 custom pieces designed specifically for medical professionals. The commissions represented more income than I'd earned in any single month since leaving Miami, but more importantly, they validated my approach to design as problem-solving rather than artistic self-expression. The craft fair's final day brought local media attention, with a reporter from the Weekly Arts newspaper interviewing several vendors about the sustainable fashion movement and its impact on traditional retail models. When she reached my booth, I found myself articulating ideas about clothing design that I'd never consciously organized into coherent philosophy. Fast fashion has trained consumers to view clothing as disposable, I explained while demonstrating the hand-finished seams that would allow my pieces to withstand years of regular wear. But well-made clothing can be a lifetime investment that actually saves money while reducing environmental impact. The interview appeared the following week with photos of my work and quotes that positioned me as an emerging voice in sustainable fashion. The publicity brought inquiries from customers as far away as Charlotte and Atlanta, women who were seeking alternatives to mass-produced clothing that didn't fit properly or reflect their personal style. Managing the increased demand required organizational skills I was still developing, but Maria and Carlos provided guidance based on their own experience growing a successful small business. They helped me establish systems for tracking custom orders, managing inventory, and maintaining quality standards while increasing production volume. Growth is a good problem to have, Carlos observed, while reviewing my order backlog, but must be careful not to grow faster than skills can support. Better to turn away work than deliver poor quality that damages reputation. His advice proved valuable, as I learned to balance customer enthusiasm with realistic production timelines. Custom work required multiple fittings and careful attention to individual preferences, making it impossible to rush projects without compromising the craftsmanship that differentiated my pieces from mass-produced alternatives. By October, my evening work sessions had evolved into a second full-time job that was generating enough income to support independent living. The prospect of leaving the alteration shop created mixed emotions: gratitude for the foundation Maria and Carlos had provided, excitement about pursuing my own vision, and anxiety about managing a business independently. "You ready?" Maria announced with characteristic directness when I finally broached the subject of transitioning to full-time independent work. "We teach you everything we can. Now you must teach yourself what we cannot show you." The conversation took place on a quiet Thursday evening while we cleaned the shop and prepared for the next day's appointments. Maria's matter-of-fact acceptance of my departure felt like the ultimate validation of our mentorship relationship, successful teaching that led to independence rather than dependence. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," I said, struggling to express gratitude that felt too large for words. "Is not true," she replied with a smile. "You have talent and work ethic. We just show you how to use what you already possess. That is what good teachers do, help students discover their own capabilities." Carlos emerged from the back room where he'd been pressing the day's completed alterations, and I realized he'd been listening to our conversation. His expression was proud but unsentimental, the look of a craftsman watching an apprentice graduate to journeyman status. "You take sewing machine," he said, gesturing toward the equipment I'd been using for months, "is old, but works perfect for someone who maintains properly. Consider graduation present." The generosity of their gift overwhelmed me, but their practical approach to my departure made the transition feel natural rather than dramatic. They'd invested time and knowledge in my development, and my success reflected well on their teaching abilities. November brought the first serious cold weather, and I established my own workspace in a converted garage that Linda helped me rent from an artist who was spending winter months in Florida. The space required significant organization to accommodate equipment, inventory, and the fitting area necessary for custom work, but the independence felt exhilarating. Working alone after months of collaborative daily interaction with Maria and Carlos required adjustments I hadn't anticipated. The silence felt oppressive initially, broken only by the sound of my sewing machine and the occasional customer consultation. But gradually the solitude became meditative, allowing complete focus on construction details and design refinements. Customer relationships deepened when I could devote undivided attention to their specific needs and preferences. Dr. Mitchell returned for additional pieces after her colleagues saw the success of her original commission, and she brought friends from other professional communities who had similar requirements for clothing that balanced appearance with functionality. "You've changed how I think about getting dressed," she confided during a fitting for her third custom piece. "Instead of choosing between looking professional and feeling comfortable, I can have both. It's a small thing, but it affects my confidence throughout the entire day." Her feedback reinforced my conviction that good design should enhance, rather than compromise the wearer's life. The clothing I created needed to work harder than decorative pieces, supporting women's professional and personal activities while making them feel confident and authentic. By December, I'd established enough regular customers to sustain independent practice while maintaining the quality standards that had built my reputation. The work challenged me daily, but the satisfaction of creating solutions for real problems made even difficult days feel purposeful. Jessica visited for the first time since I'd left Miami, arriving with Christmas gifts and curiosity about the life I'd built in the mountains. Walking through my workspace and meeting customers who'd become friends, she seemed amazed by the transformation she witnessed. "You're completely different," she observed while watching me conduct a fitting for a custom coat. "More confident, more grounded, more yourself than you've been in years." "I know who I am now," I replied, adjusting the coat's shoulder seam to accommodate the customer's posture preferences. "Instead of trying to become who someone else wanted me to be, I've discovered who I actually am when I'm free to make my own choices." The year ended with a commission that felt like validation of everything I'd learned and built. A young woman getting married in the spring wanted a wedding dress that reflected her values about sustainability and craftsmanship, while creating the romantic impact traditional brides desired. "I don't want a dress that's been mass-produced in a factory," she explained during our initial consultation. "I want something created specifically for me, by someone who understands that this dress represents the beginning of a new life." The project would challenge every skill I'd developed, while requiring creativity and technical precision that pushed beyond my current abilities. But as I began sketching initial concepts, I felt the familiar excitement that had originally drawn me to fashion design, the opportunity to create something beautiful and meaningful that would serve an important moment in someone's life. Derek's destruction of my Miami collection had felt like the end of my creative career, but sitting in my own workspace, surrounded by tools I'd mastered and fabric that would become something beautiful and useful, I realized his sabotage had accidentally given me the greatest gift possible: freedom to discover what I could create when no one else was controlling my choices. The wedding dress commission had consumed 4 months of meticulous work, every detail planned and executed with the precision that comes from understanding how much the finished piece would mean to its wearer. Hannah Morrison was getting married on the first Saturday in June, and her dress represented everything I'd learned about combining artistic vision with practical craftsmanship. The gown featured hand-sewn French seams that would allow alterations years later if needed, a bodice constructed with traditional corsetry techniques that provided support without sacrificing comfort, and a skirt that moved like liquid silk while maintaining its shape throughout a long day of celebration. The sleeves could be removed after the ceremony to transform the formal gown into a dancing dress, and tiny pearl buttons marched up the back in a design that was both classical and uniquely modern. Each pearl button had been sewn individually, positioned to create a gentle curve that followed the natural line of the spine, while ensuring the dress could be worn comfortably for 12 hours or more. The internal structure included graduated boning that distributed weight evenly, preventing the fatigue that often plagued brides wearing poorly constructed gowns. Hidden panels in the skirt allowed for natural movement, while maintaining the dress's elegant silhouette from every angle. The fabric itself had been sourced from a mill in North Carolina that specialized in sustainable silk production, ensuring the dress reflected Hannah's values about environmental responsibility while providing the luxurious feel she wanted for her wedding day. The color was pure ivory rather than stark white, chosen to complement her warm skin tone and work harmoniously with the garden setting she'd selected for her ceremony. "It's perfect," Hannah whispered during her final fitting, tears gathering in her eyes as she studied her reflection in the 3-way mirror I'd installed in my expanded workspace. "I feel like myself, but elevated, like the person I want to become as a married woman." Her reaction validated every hour I'd invested in perfecting construction techniques that most people would never notice, but that affected how the dress moved and felt throughout the day. The internal structure was as beautiful as the external appearance, with hand-finished seams and carefully placed boning that would support Hannah throughout her wedding celebration without requiring constant adjustment or creating discomfort during the long day ahead. Hannah's mother, Patricia, who had initially expressed skepticism about commissioning a wedding dress from a designer without traditional credentials, stood behind her daughter with tears streaming down her face. "Emma, you've created something that transcends fashion," she said softly. "This is museum-quality artistry." The compliment carried weight because Patricia worked as a curator at the Asheville Art Museum and understood the difference between skilled craftsmanship and mere technical competence. Her recognition of the dress as art rather than simply clothing acknowledged the creative vision I'd brought to solving the practical challenges of wedding dress construction. The fitting took place on Thursday afternoon in my converted garage workspace, which had evolved over 18 months from a simple sewing room into a professional design studio complete with proper lighting, climate control, and a dedicated fitting area. Regular customers had funded the improvements through consistent orders, and local artisans had traded services to help create an environment that felt both professional and welcoming. "The way the bodice fits is remarkable," Hannah observed, moving through the motions of dancing, sitting, and embracing that would define her wedding day activities. "I can breathe normally, but it still provides the structure and support I need. How did you achieve that balance?" I explained the corsetry techniques I'd learned through months of practice and research, studying historical construction methods while adapting them for modern comfort expectations. The internal structure included spiral steel boning that flexed with natural body movement while providing the support necessary for the dress's silhouette. Cotton coutil formed the foundation layer, creating a smooth base that eliminated the need for additional undergarments while ensuring the dress would photograph beautifully from every angle. Traditional corsetry was designed to reshape the body according to fashion ideals, I explained while making final adjustments to the shoulder seams. My approach focuses on supporting your natural figure while creating the silhouette you want. The difference is working with your body rather than against it. The philosophy extended beyond technical construction to encompass my entire approach to design. Rather than forcing clients to adapt to predetermined aesthetic standards, I created clothing that enhanced their natural beauty while serving their practical needs. Each piece began with understanding the wearer's lifestyle, body type, and personal style preferences before developing designs that would make them feel confident and authentic. Hannah's dress exemplified this approach through details that appeared effortless, but required extensive planning and skill to execute properly. The neckline had been adjusted through multiple fittings to create the most flattering possible frame for her face and neckline. The waist placement elongated her torso while accommodating her preference for higher waistlines. Even the train length had been calculated to photograph beautifully, while allowing her to move freely through outdoor ceremony and reception venues. Friday morning brought final preparations for Hannah's weekend wedding, including pressing and packaging the dress for transportation to the ceremony venue 2 hours away in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The delicate silk required careful handling, and I developed specialized techniques for maintaining the gown's pristine condition during the 24 hours between final fitting and wedding day presentation. I was alone in the workspace, systematically checking every detail one final time before the dress left my custody, when I heard a car door slam in the driveway with unnecessary force. Customers occasionally arrived unannounced, but something about the aggressive sound made me look up from my careful inspection of the hand-sewn buttonholes that secured the detachable sleeves. Through the workshop's front window, I saw a familiar silver sedan that made my stomach clench with recognition and disbelief. Derek emerged from the driver's seat wearing the casual but expensive clothing that had always marked him as someone accustomed to others accommodating his preferences. His hair was perfectly styled despite the 7-hour drive from Miami, and his expression carried the entitled confidence I remembered too well from arguments where he'd assumed his logical superiority would eventually wear down my resistance. For a moment, I froze completely, my hands still holding Hannah's wedding dress while my mind struggled to process Derek's unexpected appearance after nearly 18 months of complete silence. He'd tracked me down at the moment when I was most professionally vulnerable, surrounded by work that represented everything I'd built without his approval, guidance, or financial support. The timing felt calculated rather than coincidental. Derek possessed enough investigative resources to monitor my activities if he'd chosen to do so, and his arrival on the eve of my most prestigious commission suggested strategic planning rather than impulsive decision-making. Whatever brought him to Asheville, it involved more than casual curiosity about my welfare. "Emma," he called through the workshop door without knocking, his voice carrying the same presumptuous familiarity that had once made me feel cherished and protected. but now made my skin crawl with remembered manipulation. "We need to talk." The phrase triggered memories of countless conversations, where Derek's declaration that "we needed to talk" had preceded ultimatums disguised as reasonable discussions. His tone suggested he'd already determined the conversation's outcome and expected my compliance rather than genuine dialogue about whatever issue had motivated his unexpected journey. I carefully hung Hannah's dress on its padded hanger and covered it with protective muslin before responding to his demand for attention. Whatever Derek wanted to discuss, it wouldn't involve any risk of damaging work that represented another woman's dreams and my own professional reputation. The dress had become sacred trust that I would protect, regardless of personal disruptions. "The door's open," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt while adrenaline flooded my system in preparation for whatever confrontation Derek had planned. Derek entered my workspace with the assessing gaze he'd always used when evaluating property investments, cataloging details that revealed financial status and growth potential. His eyes moved systematically from my industrial sewing machines to the organized storage systems, from the professional pressing equipment to the customer consultation area I'd created near the large windows that provided natural light for color matching and detail work. The inventory felt invasive rather than appreciative, as if Derek was calculating the monetary value of equipment and improvements rather than recognizing the creative vision and hard work they represented. His expression revealed surprise at the professional quality of my setup, suggesting he'd expected to find amateur crafting supplies rather than legitimate business infrastructure. "Impressive," he said with the tone he'd once used to compliment my dinner party arrangements, acknowledgement that carried undertones of surprise that I'd managed competence without his guidance and oversight. "You've built quite a little operation here." The dismissive phrase "little operation" revealed more about his mindset than he probably intended. Despite visual evidence of professional success surrounding him, Derek couldn't conceive of my work as legitimate business worthy of respect or recognition. In his worldview, anything I created independently remained hobby rather than serious commercial enterprise that could compete with real businesses managed by properly credentialed professionals. His assessment also carried the implication that size determined legitimacy, ignoring the possibility that deliberately small scale might reflect values about sustainability, quality, and community connection, rather than limitations of ambition or capability. Derek had always equated growth with success, unable to appreciate achievements that prioritized depth over breadth. "What do you want, Derek?" I asked directly, continuing to organize tools and materials for Monday's scheduled appointments while he conducted his evaluation. Physical activity helped manage the anxiety his presence created, while demonstrating that his arrival wouldn't disrupt my established routines or professional commitments. "I want my wife back," he said simply, as if the 18 months of silence and legal divorce proceedings had been minor interruptions rather than fundamental life changes that had permanently altered our relationship status. "I've been patient, letting you work through whatever crisis this represented, but it's time to come home where you belong." His casual assumption that my new life constituted a crisis to be worked through revealed how little he understood about the transformation I'd undergone since leaving Miami. Derek still viewed my departure as temporary rebellion that would eventually yield to practical considerations rather than permanent evolution toward authentic independence and creative fulfillment. The phrase "where you belong" particularly grated because it reduced my agency to geographic location, rather than acknowledging the fundamental changes in my values, priorities, and self-perception that had made return impossible, regardless of practical considerations. Derek's worldview couldn't accommodate the possibility that I might have discovered forms of belonging he couldn't provide or control. "I'm not your wife anymore," I reminded him calmly, gesturing toward the divorce decree I'd framed and hung on my workshop wall alongside business licenses and professional certifications. "Those papers your lawyer prepared were quite thorough about ending our legal relationship permanently." Derek followed my gesture and studied the framed documents with the careful attention he'd always given to contracts and legal agreements that might contain implications for his financial interests or personal plans. When he turned back toward me, his expression had shifted from confident assumption to tactical calculation, as he recalibrated his approach. "Legal technicalities can be corrected easily enough," he said dismissively, waving his hand as if dissolving a divorce required nothing more than filing different paperwork. What matters is that we belong together. You've proven you can be independent when necessary, but this phase has run its course. Ashley's engaged now to someone who appreciates her artistic vision, so there won't be the same family pressures that caused our previous difficulties. The revelation that Ashley had found someone willing to marry her surprised me less than Derek's assumption that family dynamics had been the primary source of our marital problems. His analysis reduced years of systematic control and manipulation to simple interpersonal conflict that could be resolved through changed circumstances, rather than fundamental alterations in power dynamics and mutual respect. His characterization of my objections to Ashley's inclusion in my fashion show as family pressures also demonstrated his continuing inability to recognize the difference between reasonable professional standards and arbitrary personal preferences. In Derek's mind, my refusal to compromise artistic integrity remained family conflict rather than business decision based on quality considerations. Family pressures weren't the problem, Derek, I said, setting down the pins I'd been organizing to give him my full attention. Your need to control every aspect of my life was the problem. The way you dismissed my work as hobby rather than legitimate career was the problem. Your assumption that I existed to support your priorities without having valid goals of my own was the fundamental problem that destroyed our marriage. Derek's jaw tightened in the familiar way I remembered from arguments where his logical supremacy was challenged by perspectives he couldn't dismiss as emotional irrationality or feminine confusion. He surveyed my workspace again, this time with calculating attention to details that suggested financial success and professional legitimacy he hadn't expected to encounter. The silence stretched uncomfortably while Derek processed my direct challenge to his interpretation of our relationship dynamics. During our marriage, such confrontations had usually ended with my apologetic retreat, rather than sustained criticism of his behavior patterns. My willingness to maintain position rather than seek reconciliation clearly surprised him. Fine, he said finally, his tone suggesting strategic concession rather than genuine acceptance of my perspective. You've made your point about independence and professional competence. But look at what you're actually doing, Emma. Alterations and custom sewing in a converted garage. Yes, it's charming and self-sufficient, but it's not sustainable long-term strategy for someone with your talents and potential. His criticism probed legitimate concerns that I'd considered during sleepless nights, when customer orders seemed overwhelming and business responsibilities felt crushing. Building independent enterprise required confronting uncertainties that employment with Derek had never demanded, and his strategic mind had identified exactly the vulnerabilities that sometimes made me question my choices during difficult periods. What happens when your hands can't handle this kind of detailed work anymore? He continued, warming to his theme as he identified potential weaknesses in my business model. What happens when trends change and customers want something you can't provide? What happens when competition from online retailers makes custom work economically unviable? You're building a house of cards that could collapse at any moment. The questions forced me to confront practical realities I'd been avoiding through focus on daily operations rather than long-term strategic planning. Derek's business acumen was considerable, and his concerns about market sustainability and physical limitations carried weight that I couldn't dismiss as mere manipulation or control tactics. Those are reasonable concerns, I admitted, surprising him with agreement rather than defensive resistance to his analysis. But they're my concerns to manage, my risks to evaluate, my decisions to make based on my own assessment of acceptable trade-offs. That's what independence means. Accepting responsibility for outcomes instead of trading autonomy for security. But you don't have to accept those risks alone, Derek pressed, stepping closer with the enthusiasm he'd always shown when presenting solutions to problems I hadn't asked him to solve. We could relocate the business to Miami, expand your customer base significantly, leverage my contacts in luxury markets throughout Florida and the Southeast. Think about what you could accomplish with proper financial backing and professional management support. The offer was seductive in ways Derek had calculated precisely, appealing to professional desires I'd harbored since beginning my independent practice. He'd identified my greatest aspirations: expanded opportunities, financial security, access to sophisticated clientele who could afford museum-quality work, and presented himself as the means to achieve them quickly rather than building gradually through local market development. In our marriage, this pattern had been irresistible, because Derek had always delivered on promises, while gradually increasing my dependence on his support systems and business networks. His strategic thinking had opened doors I couldn't have accessed independently, making his control seem like partnership rather than manipulation, until the costs became impossible to ignore. And who would make the major business decisions? I asked, already knowing the answer, but curious whether Derek had developed any awareness of his controlling tendencies during our months of separation. Who would determine pricing strategies, customer selection criteria, design direction, production schedules, marketing approaches? We'd make them together, of course. True partnership in every sense of the word, Derek replied with rehearsed smoothness that suggested he'd practiced this conversation during the long drive from Miami. I've learned from our previous mistakes and misunderstandings. No more competing priorities, no more family interference, just two people building something significant together. The phrase, "our previous mistakes," revealed Derek's interpretation of our marital problems as mutual failures, rather than systematic patterns of control and manipulation that had gradually eroded my autonomy. Even his apologies contained subtle redirections of responsibility that absolved him while suggesting I'd contributed equally to problems I'd primarily endured rather than created. His promise of true partnership also rang hollow, because Derek had never demonstrated ability to share decision-making authority when his preferences conflicted with alternative perspectives. His idea of partnership involved my enthusiastic support for his strategic vision, rather than genuine collaboration between equals with different but complementary skills and insights. "Show me," I said, gesturing toward Hannah's wedding dress hanging in its protective covering. "If we're truly partners now, demonstrate how you'd handle a situation where my professional judgment conflicts with your business instincts and market analysis." Derek approached the covered dress with curiosity, though his expression suggested he didn't understand why I was focusing on a single commission rather than discussing broader strategic questions about business expansion and market positioning. His confusion revealed how differently we conceptualize the relationship between individual projects and overall professional identity. When I lifted the muslin covering to reveal the completed gown, Derek's reaction was immediate and predictably enthusiastic. His aesthetic sense had always been sophisticated, and genuine craftsmanship invariably impressed him regardless of commercial considerations. "Emma, this is absolutely exquisite work," he said with sincere admiration that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him years earlier. "The construction quality is exceptional, and the design strikes exactly the right balance between traditional elegance and contemporary sophistication. This could easily sell for $10,000 in the right Miami boutique." His praise felt like validation from someone whose aesthetic judgment I'd once trusted completely, and whose opinion had shaped my early development as a designer. Derek had always possessed refined taste and genuine appreciation for craftsmanship, qualities that had initially made his guidance valuable rather than oppressive. But his immediate pivot to commercial valuation also demonstrated the fundamental difference in how we approached creative work. Where I saw artistic achievement and customer satisfaction, Derek automatically calculated profit margins and market positioning strategies that could maximize financial return on time investment. "Thank you for recognizing the quality," I said carefully. "Now, here's the partnership test that will show me whether you've actually changed." This customer paid $3,500 for the dress, which represents approximately 70 hours of my time plus materials. You've just identified high-end Miami markets that might pay significantly more for comparable work. Do we honor our commitment to deliver this dress as promised, or do we find a way to retain it for a more profitable customer? Derek studied the dress more carefully, and I could see him calculating market values and profit margins with the analytical skills that had built his successful real estate empire. His initial aesthetic appreciation was being replaced by commercial assessment, exactly the thought process that had gradually corrupted every aspect of our relationship by reducing creative decisions to financial optimization. "Obviously, we honor the commitment to this customer," he said carefully, recognizing the trap I'd set but uncertain about the lesson I was attempting to teach. "Reputation for reliability is crucial for long-term business success. But going forward, we'd need pricing strategies that reflect true market value, rather than local mountain town economics that undervalue sophisticated craftsmanship. And if this customer wants last-minute modifications that I consider artistically compromising but that would increase her satisfaction and referral potential to other high-paying customers, well, Customer satisfaction is absolutely crucial for business growth, so reasonable accommodations would certainly be wise strategy, Derek replied, still not grasping the fundamental philosophical differences my questions were designed to reveal. And if those accommodations require construction shortcuts that save time and reduce costs, but compromise the longevity and quality standards I've built my reputation on? Derek's expression shifted as he began to understand that my questions weren't hypothetical scenarios but fundamental philosophical differences about how business should operate when profit motives conflicted with artistic integrity and craftsmanship standards. His instinct to optimize financial returns would inevitably conflict with my commitment to quality that served customers' long-term interests rather than short-term business metrics. "Emma, you're creating artificial conflicts where none need to exist," he said with growing frustration at my refusal to accept his reasonable business logic. "There's no reason we can't maintain quality standards while building profitable enterprise. It's simply about finding the right balance between artistic vision and commercial viability." "Whose definition of balance?" I asked directly. "When your profit projections suggest I should accept rush orders that require working 70-hour weeks, whose priorities take precedence? When market research indicates customers want features I consider aesthetically inappropriate or technically inferior, who decides whether to accommodate those preferences? When efficiency experts recommend production shortcuts that save money but reduce the craftsmanship quality that differentiates my work, whose values determine the final decision?" The questions forced Derek to confront the fundamental control issues he'd never acknowledged during our marriage, or apparently during the months since our divorce. His business success had been built on making strategic decisions quickly and expecting others to implement his vision efficiently, without questioning underlying assumptions or alternative approaches. True partnership would require sharing authority in ways his personality found genuinely difficult, if not impossible. Derek's strength lay in strategic analysis and rapid decision-making. But those skills became liabilities when applied to creative work that required different values and decision-making processes than real estate development. A car engine sounded in the driveway, interrupting our increasingly tense conversation, and I looked out to see Sophia's familiar pickup truck pulling behind Derek's sedan. She emerged carrying a large coffee and wearing the paint-stained overalls that indicated she'd been working on a weaving project that morning. Her arrival felt like reinforcement arriving just when I needed community support most desperately. "Emma, I brought you that color card you requested for the Morrison project," Sophia called, approaching the workshop with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in my space and understood my work. When she noticed Derek standing near my work table, her expression shifted to polite curiosity, mixed with protective wariness that suggested she'd heard enough about my former marriage to be suspicious of his motivations. "Sophia, this is Derek, my former husband," I said, emphasizing the word former while managing the introduction carefully. "Derek. Sophia is a fellow artist and close friend who's been invaluable in helping me establish my business here." The introduction required Derek to acknowledge that I'd built relationships and community connections independent of his influence, something that clearly surprised him given his systematic isolation of me from supportive friendships during our marriage. He'd always controlled my social interactions by subtly criticizing friends who might provide alternative perspectives on our relationship dynamics. "Pleased to meet you," Sophia said with southern politeness, that didn't quite mask her protective assessment of Derek's potential threat to my well-being. "Emma's told us so much about her previous life and how much she's grown since discovering her true calling here in the mountains." The emphasis on previous life and true calling suggested Sophia knew more about my reasons for leaving Miami than Derek might expect, and her protective positioning near my work table indicated she wouldn't be easily dismissed or intimidated if conflict arose during their encounter. "I'm sure she has," Derek replied with the controlled charm he used for social situations that required managing people he considered irrelevant to his primary objectives. "I've come to discuss some exciting opportunities that might take Emma back to Miami's fashion scene, where her talents could reach their full potential." "How wonderful for Emma to have choices," Sophia responded with deceptive sweetness that barely concealed her disapproval of Derek's presumptuous attitude. "She's built such a successful business here, with customers who genuinely appreciate her artistic vision and ethical approach to fashion. I can't imagine her wanting to give up the creative freedom and community connections she's worked so hard to achieve." The conversation was becoming a coded battle between Derek's attempts to minimize my Asheville success and Sophia's determination to defend both my achievements and my autonomy. Derek's political skills were considerable, honed through years of business negotiations, but Sophia possessed the home field advantage of understanding my values and priorities. "Well, I should let you two continue your business discussion," Sophia said, though her departure felt strategic rather than purely polite. "Emma, I'll call you later about the wedding delivery schedule. Hannah's so excited about her dress. She says you've created something that will become a treasured family heirloom for generations." After Sophia left, Derek studied me with renewed attention, as if her comments had revealed aspects of my current life that fundamentally challenged his assumptions about small-town limitations and customer sophistication. The mention of heirloom quality work and multi-generational significance suggested I'd achieved professional recognition and customer loyalty that contradicted his dismissive characterization of my business as temporary phase rather than legitimate career choice. "She seems quite protective of you," Derek observed with the analytical tone he used when encountering unexpected variables in business situations. "How long have you known her?" "Sophia's been a close friend since my early months here. So have Maria and Carlos, who taught me everything I know about advanced garment construction techniques. And Linda, who helped me establish proper business systems and accounting procedures. And Rebecca, who connected me with my first commissioned customers. I have genuine community here, Derek. Real relationships based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than social utility and business networking." The comparison to our Miami social circle, where relationships had been carefully cultivated for professional advancement rather than personal connection, clearly registered with Derek, though he tried to maintain his composed expression. He'd always prided himself on strategic relationship management, but I'd learned to distinguish between professional contacts and authentic friendships that survived disagreements and supported personal growth. "Emma, I'm not asking you to abandon the relationships you've built or dismiss the valuable skills you've developed," Derek said, modifying his approach in response to my obvious community support. "I'm offering you the opportunity to expand beyond what's naturally possible in a small mountain town with limited markets. Think about the sophisticated clients you could serve, the industry recognition you could achieve, the financial security we could build together." His arguments contained truth that I couldn't dismiss entirely or easily. Asheville's market did have natural limitations that constrained growth potential, and expanding my reach would require capital and connections I couldn't develop independently within reasonable timeframes. Derek's business network could provide immediate access to customers who would pay premium prices for museum-quality work without requiring years of gradual reputation building. But I'd learned to recognize the subtle manipulation embedded in his apparently generous offers. Partnership with Derek had always meant accepting his strategic vision while contributing labor and creativity to achieve goals he'd defined unilaterally. The financial benefits would come with constraints on artistic autonomy that would gradually erode the creative satisfaction I'd rediscovered through independent practice. "What if I said no?" I asked directly, forcing him to confront the possibility that his offer might be rejected despite its apparent attractiveness. "What if I chose to maintain my current life exactly as it is, without expansion or increased profits or access to your Miami connections and business networks?" Derek's carefully maintained mask slipped slightly, revealing the frustration he felt when logical arguments failed to produce expected compliance from people he considered reasonable. During our marriage, this moment had usually preceded either ultimatums designed to force compliance or strategic withdrawal of support to demonstrate the consequences of opposing his will. "Then you'd be settling for comfortable mediocrity when genuine excellence is within your reach," he said with the disappointed tone he'd perfected for occasions when I failed to appreciate opportunities he'd created. "You'd be choosing security over growth, comfort over achievement, local recognition over industry impact. I'd be choosing autonomy over control, creativity over profit maximization, authentic relationships over strategic networking, personal integrity over expedient compromise," I replied, my response surprising both of us with its clarity and confidence. "Everything I've built here reflects values I never had space to explore when I was trying to become whoever you thought I should be." Derek stared at me as if seeing clearly for the first time since arriving in Asheville. The woman he'd married and attempted to rescue had indeed disappeared, replaced by someone who possessed confidence he hadn't provided, and values he hadn't shaped through years of subtle guidance and correction. His strategic planning had been based on assumptions about my character and motivations that were no longer accurate, if they'd ever been true. The Emma he remembered had desperately needed his approval and financial support to function in the world. The Emma who stood before him now had built her own successful life, using skills and perspectives he'd never encouraged or recognized. "You've fundamentally changed," he said quietly, and for the first time since arriving, his voice carried genuine emotion rather than calculated persuasion or strategic charm. "You're not the same person I married. I've grown into who I always could have been if I hadn't been too afraid to risk your disapproval and withdrawal of support," I replied honestly. The admission felt liberating because it acknowledged his influence without excusing my own complicity in patterns that had diminished both of us over time. We stood in silence while Derek processed the realization that his carefully planned reconciliation strategy was failing because it had been designed for a woman who no longer existed. The financial incentives, strategic opportunities, and emotional appeals that might have worked 18 months ago had no power over someone who discovered alternative sources of validation and security. "Is there anything I could offer that would convince you to reconsider?" he asked finally, his voice carrying resignation that suggested he already knew the answer but needed to hear it stated explicitly. "No, Derek, there isn't," I said gently but firmly. "Not because you're fundamentally evil, or because I don't remember the positive aspects of our relationship, but because I've learned that I can't be in partnership with someone who sees my autonomy as obstacle to their vision, rather than asset to our shared goals." He nodded slowly, understanding that this conversation had reached its natural conclusion without possibility of appeal or negotiation. Whatever reconciliation fantasies had motivated his trip to Asheville were being abandoned in favor of accepting reality he couldn't control or manipulate through logical argument or strategic pressure. "I should let you get back to your work," he said, gathering his dignity with the grace he'd always shown in business situations that didn't proceed according to plan. "The dress really is extraordinary, Emma. Whoever receives it will treasure it forever." "Thank you. That means a lot, coming from someone whose aesthetic judgment I've always respected," I replied sincerely, acknowledging the positive aspects of our shared history without allowing them to complicate my current decision. Derek paused at the workshop door, seeming to consider whether to make one final appeal or threat that might change the outcome he couldn't accept. Instead, he simply said, "I hope you find everything you're looking for." "I already have," I replied, gesturing toward the workspace that represented not just professional success, but personal authenticity finally achieved. More than I knew I was looking for when I started this journey. After Derek left, I sat quietly in my workshop for several minutes, surrounded by evidence of the life I'd built through daily choices that honored my values, rather than someone else's expectations. Hannah's wedding dress hung like a promise that beautiful things could be created through patience and skill applied with love and respect for the person who would wear the finished piece. Orders from satisfied customers covered my desk, representing problems I'd solved and relationships I'd built through honest work that served real needs rather than abstract artistic concepts. The visit that should have disrupted my confidence had instead confirmed how thoroughly I'd transformed from the woman who'd needed Derek's approval to function in the world. His offer of expanded opportunities held no appeal, because expansion without authenticity felt like regression rather than growth. I'd learned that success measured by someone else's standards was hollow, compared to achievement that reflected my own values and served my community's genuine needs. Hannah's wedding took place the following afternoon in a garden setting that complemented her dress perfectly. As she moved through the ceremony and reception, the gown flowed and adapted exactly as I'd designed it to, supporting her celebration without requiring adjustments or repairs throughout the long day. Watching her dance with her new husband while wearing something I'd created with my own hands provided satisfaction that no amount of Derek's approval could have matched. The dress had become part of her story, a tangible reminder of the moment when she'd committed to building a life based on love and mutual respect, rather than convenience or social expectation. The following weeks brought a steady stream of referrals from wedding guests who'd been impressed by Hannah's dress and curious about commissioning pieces for their own special occasions. Word-of-mouth recommendations proved more effective than any marketing strategy Derek had ever employed during my Miami career, with satisfied customers bringing friends who shared similar values and aesthetic preferences. A month after Derek's visit, Jessica called to report that he'd contacted mutual friends from our Miami social circle, apparently seeking information about my current situation and potential vulnerabilities he might exploit in future reconciliation attempts. He seemed genuinely shocked that you'd actually built a successful business, Jessica reported with amusement. Like he couldn't believe you were capable of independence without his management and guidance. I told him you were the happiest I'd ever seen you and suggested he focus on moving forward rather than looking backward at what couldn't be changed. The conversation confirmed that Derek's visit had been based on genuine surprise rather than calculated strategy. He'd expected to find me struggling with poverty and isolation, ripe for rescue by someone who could provide the security and direction he assumed I desperately needed. Discovering evidence of genuine success and community support had undermined the foundation of his reconciliation approach, forcing him to confront the possibility that his version of partnership might not be as attractive as he'd assumed. Summer progressed with steady growth in both customer base and technical complexity of commissioned pieces. Dr. Mitchell referred colleagues from medical centers throughout the region, creating demand for professional clothing designed specifically for healthcare environments where appearance and functionality both mattered. Hannah's wedding photos inspired inquiries from brides seeking custom gowns that reflected personal values rather than industry trends, leading to a waiting list that extended 6 months into the future. Each commission brought new challenges that pushed my skills in directions I couldn't have anticipated when I'd first arrived in Asheville, with basic alteration abilities and desperate need for any work that would provide income. Most significantly, Linda approached me about collaborating on a small retail space that would showcase local artisans while providing customers with access to custom design services. The partnership would allow expansion without compromising the personal relationships and creative autonomy that made my work fulfilling rather than merely profitable. You've proven that sustainable fashion can be profitable fashion, Linda explained while we toured the available space in Asheville's downtown arts district. What you need now is visibility that matches your reputation for quality and innovation. The retail collaboration represented exactly the kind of organic growth that felt aligned with my values. Expansion based on customer demand and community support, rather than external pressure to achieve arbitrary financial targets or market penetration goals. Derek's visit had clarified that I wanted growth that enhanced rather than compromised the creative satisfaction I'd found. By autumn, the retail space was established and thriving, with my custom work displayed alongside Sophia's handwoven textiles, Rebecca's artistic quilts, and ceramics from local artists whose values aligned with our collective commitment to sustainable, ethical production methods that respected both creators and customers. Visitors appreciated the story behind each piece, the opportunity to meet creators and understand their processes, and the knowledge that their purchases supported local artisans rather than anonymous corporations focused primarily on profit maximization. The collaborative approach created synergies that benefited all participants while serving customers who valued authenticity over mass-market convenience. The success felt fundamentally different from anything I'd experienced during my Miami fashion career, because it was built on relationships and shared values rather than competition and status seeking. Each satisfied customer brought referrals from people who shared similar priorities, creating sustainable growth that felt natural rather than forced or pressured. Derek's prediction that I'd regret choosing independence over security had been proven wrong, in ways that neither of us could have anticipated when he'd driven away from that Italian town 18 months earlier. Independence hadn't meant isolation or financial struggle. It had meant discovering capabilities I'd never been encouraged to develop, and finding community among people who valued authenticity over ambition. On the first anniversary of Derek's visit, I stood in my expanded workshop space, preparing for a trunk show that would feature new designs inspired by the changing seasons and the diverse women who'd become my regular customers. The clothing reflected everything I'd learned about combining beauty with function, tradition with innovation, individual expression with practical wearability. Sophia arrived early to help with setup, carrying coffee and the kind of easy conversation that had become central to my daily happiness. "Hard to believe it's been a full year since your ex-husband tried to rescue you from success," she observed with characteristic directness that had become one of my favorite aspects of mountain culture. He wasn't wrong about everything, I admitted while arranging accessories that complemented the featured garments. This life does involve uncertainties and risks that steady employment never required. But the uncertainties are mine to navigate, and the risks are calculated choices rather than imposed conditions. And if he showed up again today with the same offer and arguments? I considered the question seriously, because Derek's arguments had contained legitimate points about growth potential and financial security that couldn't be dismissed as mere manipulation. But a year of additional independence had strengthened my confidence in ways that made his control mechanisms less appealing rather than more necessary. I'd thank him for the offer and invite him to see what I've built without his assistance, I replied while adjusting the lighting to showcase fabric textures properly. Then I'd suggest he find someone who actually needs rescuing because I'm not that person anymore, and I never want to be her again. The trunk show drew customers from throughout the region, many of whom had traveled specifically to commission pieces that reflected their personal style while supporting ethical fashion practices they believed in. Orders exceeded expectations, but more importantly, conversations throughout the day confirmed that I'd found my authentic voice as both designer and businesswoman. As evening approached and the last customers departed with their purchases and commission appointments scheduled for the coming months, I found myself surrounded by evidence of what was possible when creative work aligned perfectly with personal values and community needs. The financial success was gratifying and provided security I'd never achieved during my marriage, but the relationships built through honest craftsmanship and shared values provided satisfaction that no amount of Derek's approval could have matched. I'd learned the difference between being successful according to someone else's definition and being fulfilled according to my own authentic desires. Maria and Carlos arrived as I was cleaning up, bringing dinner from their favorite restaurant and curiosity about the day's events. Their pride in my success felt parental in the best possible way, celebration of achievement earned through effort and growth rather than inherited privilege or granted favor from powerful patrons. "You look genuinely happy," Maria observed while we shared wine and stories from the day's customer interactions. "Not just successful or satisfied, but truly happy with the success you've achieved and the life you've built." "I am happy," I realized, surprised by the simplicity and complete truth of the statement. Not because everything is perfect or because I've eliminated all uncertainty from my future, but because I'm building something that reflects who I actually am rather than who someone else thought I should become. The conversation continued late into the evening, ranging from practical business considerations to philosophical reflections on creativity, community, and the courage required to choose authenticity over security. These were the kinds of relationships Derek's systematic control had made impossible. Friendships based on mutual respect and shared values rather than social utility and strategic networking advantages. When I finally climbed the stairs to my apartment above the expanded workshop, I paused to look back at the space that represented everything I'd learned about independence, creativity, and the deep satisfaction that comes from work that serves others while honoring personal values and artistic integrity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, custom orders that would test my continually growing skills, and opportunities to expand in directions I couldn't yet imagine. Derek's destruction of my Miami collection had felt like the end of my creative career, but standing in my own thriving business, surrounded by evidence of community support and customer loyalty, I understood that his sabotage had accidentally provided the greatest gift possible. The woman who'd been too afraid to risk his disapproval had disappeared completely, replaced by someone who'd discovered that authentic success was worth more than borrowed security, and that true partnership could only exist between equals who chose each other freely, rather than people bound by dependence and control. The mountain air drifted through my windows, carrying the scent of changing seasons and the promise that growth was always possible for those willing to plant new seeds in fertile ground, and tend them with patience, skill, and unwavering commitment to their own authentic vision. Derek had thought he was teaching me a lesson about dependence and the consequences of defying his authority. Instead, he'd revealed my capacity for independence that had been waiting for the right circumstances to flourish into something beautiful, sustainable, and entirely my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.